memoirs, diaries, testimonies, or digital media reminds us that self-representation is never actually a solitary act. Each personal narrative is embedded in networks of translation, mediation, and reception. And as our speaker today will show us, these individual stories do not simply describe the world, they help to make it. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Helga Lenart-Cheng, whose work bridges life writing, world literature, and cultural memory. She teaches at St. Mary's College of California and has written extensively on how stories of the self across media and across borders participate in what Peng Chea calls the worlding of literature. The idea that literature doesn't merely circulate in the world, but actively helps create it. Professor Lenart-Cheng is the co-editor with Professor Ioana Luca of the recent volume Life Writing as World Literature from Bloomsbury Publications, a landmark collection that asks how autobiographical storytelling functions as an ethical and political form of world making. The volume brings together feminist, postcolonial, and transnational perspectives to show how personal narratives, whether in print, visual, or digital forms, carry the power to reimagine belonging and accountability across languages and cultures. Her earlier book, Story Revolutions, Collective Narratives from the Enlightenment to the Digital Age, traces how storytelling practices, from revolutionary manifestos to online platforms, create shared spaces of transformation and resistance. Today's talk, titled Telling Lives Across Borders, Life Narratives in the World Literary Context, continues this inquiry. It invites us to think of life writing not only as a literary genre, but as a lived, world-making act, one that reminds us that world literature is sustained not just by the circulation of texts, but by fragile, embodied lives that give those texts their urgency. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Helga Lenart-Cheng. Helga, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dogangun and Dr. Oz, for your kind words and for hosting this webinar. It is an honor to be here, and I will try to wrap up in about 45 minutes, so we will have time for discussion. So if you have the time, please stay. I would love to engage and have a dialogue at the end. So since this is a lecture about personal stories, I wanted to begin with one of my own. Because world literature for me has never been just an academic concept. It's something that I grew up inside. I'm originally from Hungary, where world literature took some of its earliest institutional forms through one of the first comparative literature journals, that remarkable little Transylvanian publication called Acta Comparationis Literarum Universarum. It imagined global literary exchange from a small provincial corner of Europe in 19th century. So knowing this history, I've always felt kind of an inherited responsibility for small languages and for less translated literatures. And when I moved to the United States for my PhD, that sense of mission became both personal and political. Seeing my determination to keep speaking Hungarian, a language of only about 10, 15 million speakers, my advisor once joked that I might someday be one of its last speakers, kept in a zoo for exhibition. And later, when I proposed translating Paul Ricoeur's philosophy into Hungarian, the same advisor asked, why would you do that? People who read Ricoeur already know English or French? And so that question stayed with me, and in a way, it only strengthened my resolve. So these days, I mostly publish in English, but I do continue to reflect on the place of small languages and of small personal stories within world literature. Both life writing and world literature raise urgent questions of voice and visibility. Whose stories, whose languages, whose lives are allowed to circulate globally? What are the conditions of that circulation? And who controls them? What happens to a story when it crosses linguistic or cultural borders? What is lost? What is gained? What is transformed along the way? Can a minor language still speak to the world without surrendering its intimacy, its texture, its difference? And finally, how might we imagine a world literature that listens as much as it translates? A world literature that allows small voices to be heard on their own terms. So before I go any further, I want to pause and thank all of you for being here today. Your presence already signals something important. It shows care and commitment to the very questions that we are gathering around. So in that sense, you all are already part of the answer. So I've been fortunate to belong to two scholarly communities that have shaped my thinking on this topic, my colleagues in world literature and my colleagues in life writing studies. And there is, of course, a meaningful overlap between the two fields, and it was precisely at that intersection that a new conversation began about 5 years ago with my dear colleague, Ioana Luca. Like me, Ioana inhabits several worlds at once. We both grew up behind the Iron Curtain. Today, she actually teaches in Taiwan, where she works in American and post-socialist literature. And our shared fascination with transnational voices and with the power of narrative self-expression soon became the seed of a larger collaboration. When we first proposed the idea of a volume exploring the place of personal stories in world literature, we began with a few basic questions. We started from the observation that we live in an age of popular self-representation around the globe. People are constantly producing and consuming autobiographical material, memoirs, blogs, but even social media posts and graphic memoirs, and even the humble selfie. So the question is, why do some of these stories get picked up, translated, and taught in classrooms, while others remain moored in local waters? Do popular life stories share certain features that make them portable? Or is it the other way around? Is it our very notion of world literature that imposes recognizable patterns and expectations on them? And perhaps most importantly, what can we gain by studying life writing and world literature together, not as separate disciplines, but as intersecting practices? So when we put out a call for papers for what would become our edited volume, Life Writing as World Literature, the response was overwhelming. Scholars from across the globe, writing in a wide range of languages, reached out to join the conversation, and it quickly became clear to us that we had touched a nerve, that this was a timely topic just waiting to be brought into focus. So what energized the project most was actually the dialogue itself, the excitement of exchanging drafts across time zones and realizing that our own multilingual transnational lives mirrored the very questions that we were asking. So we first organized a 2-day panel at the American Comparative Literature Association's conference, followed by another one at the International Autobiography Association conference, before finalizing our list of contributors. So the volume, and you can see it here, which I hope you've had or soon will have a chance to hold in your hands, opens with John Zern's essay. Hello, John. I just saw you here. So John offers a kind of meta-reflection on the very question I'm also raising today. Can life writing, so deeply tied to place, to self, to the ethics of representation, ever truly fit within the framework of world literature? His piece sets the tone for the 5 sections that follow. The first one that you can see here takes up the ethics of reading and representation, asking what responsibilities we bear when we collect, classify, or cite other people's stories. The second part explores regional and transnational autobiographical traditions from South Africa to the Caribbean to Australia, showing how local lives move into global circulation and how personal stories travel across borders, languages, and markets. The third section turns to questions of translation and canon formation, with chapters on Japanese diary writing, Taiwanese migrant narratives, and Venezuelan testimonies, all of which challenge our very sense of what world literature means and who gets to define it. The fourth section turns to memory and resistance, ranging from Eastern European prison narratives to Nicaraguan and Dalit feminist life stories, each showing how personal testimony can become a form of collective resistance and remembrance. And finally, the fifth section turns to life writing as activism and everyday practice, from illness narratives and children's drawings from Ukraine to activist comics and visual storytelling. So these essays remind us that personal expression can itself be a form of resistance. And then the volume concludes with S. Shankar's powerful afterword, which urges us to drop the term world literature altogether, along with the monopolizing tendencies it carries, in favor of the more inclusive literatures of the world. So let me take a moment for a brief but entirely well-intentioned plug. So I really encourage you to get your hands on this volume, or better yet, order it for your library, because as its co-editor, I couldn't be prouder of the richness and range of essays that it brings together. And I'm especially delighted to see some of our contributors here today. So a heartfelt shout out to you as we send this new volume out into the world. So today I want to share some personal, though admittedly somewhat theoretical, reflections on the place of personal stories in world literature. I'll be asking how these narratives move across borders, languages, and media. Is there something about life writing itself that demands a different way of reading, a different kind of attention? So let me begin with a few definitions, just to establish some common ground, or maybe not. So I've been using the term life writing as if it were familiar to all of you, but I'm well aware that it's actually a rather limited term. It's a recent umbrella concept that was developed mainly by feminist and post-colonial scholars who wanted to challenge the old illusion of an autonomous, self-contained individual in traditional Western autobiography. They sought instead to highlight what one critic called the heterogeneity of self-referential practices and to create a more inclusive framework for all the different ways people represent their lives. But the term life writing never actually caught on beyond Anglophone circles, and to be honest, I have never quite liked it myself. My main objection is that it puts too much emphasis on writing, when one of the most important features of personal storytelling is precisely its multimodality. The fact that it exists not just in written form, but in speech, in images, in gestures, and now, of course, also across digital platforms. So what unites these practices is not their medium, but the investment in giving shape to lived experience. One thing I do appreciate about the term life writing, though, is that it includes the word life. Because by inserting that word and by binding life and literature together, scholars of life writing made a crucial point about the embeddedness of literature in lived experience. And that is important, and I'll come back to it later. For now, I'll just keep using the term life writing as a kind of shorthand, although personally, I still prefer the phrase personal storytelling. So in this lecture, I'll be using a broad and inclusive definition of life writing, one that embraces all forms of personal storytelling across genres, media, and cultural contexts. In this sense, life writing is both a literary and an existential practice, a way of sorting experience, sustaining identity, and making meaning out of contingency. Whether we think of it as a discourse, rhetoric, or performance, life writing is also a form of action, a social act that encodes and reshapes the values by which we live. As Laura Marcus reminds us, life writing is central not only for offering an understanding of the ways in which lives have been lived, but for providing the most fundamental accounts of what it means to be a self in the world. So to speak of the worlding power of life writing is to recognize that our stories do not simply mirror the world, but they actively help bring it into being. I take a similarly broad multifocal view of world literature. For simplicity, I'll continue using the term in the singular, but I want to acknowledge from the start that there are, in fact, many literatures of the world with multiple genealogies and unequal structures of circulation. And so when I speak of world literature, I mean a field that seeks to trace the intricate networks connecting human experiences, while also honoring the local and embodied conditions of each act of storytelling and the distortions, of course, produced by the global literary marketplace. So of course, that's easier said than done, because if you look at the field as it stands today, world literature scholarship actually makes very little room for autobiographical genres. So let me begin right here with this gap, with this absence, this lack of interest, if you will, or this blind spot, because it is what first caught my attention. If you look at the past 20 years or so of world literature scholarship, a curious pattern emerges, one that becomes more puzzling the more we think about it. Most studies in world literature have focused almost exclusively on fictional forms, mostly the epic, the novel, the short story, sometimes poetry. Non-fictional genres, autobiography, memoir, biography, diaries, letters, essays, travel writing, blogs, graphic memoirs, testimonial narratives have remained, by comparison, really on the margins. So in other words, the great conversations about what counts as world literature have rarely included the many ways people around the world write about their own lives. So if you think of the voices that have shaped this field, and I don't mean to be exclusionary here, but just some names: David Damrosch, Vaichi Dimok, Peng Chia, Pascal Casanova, Shumeishi, Debjani Ganguly, Rebecca Volkovits, Huda Tanuki, Mariano Siskin, Stefan Helgeson, they all, in very different ways, return to the same core materials, usually the novel and the epic. Even Franco Moretti and his colleagues at the Stanford Literary Lab, who use what he famously called the distant reading to map global literary systems, have worked overwhelmingly with fiction. And this focus isn't accidental. Scholars have offered many explanations for why fiction in general, and the novel in particular, has so thoroughly dominated the field of world literature. Debjani Ganguly puts it quite clearly in her introduction to the Cambridge History of World Literature when she writes, "Given its popularity, portability, and translatability as a global genre, the novel has typically dominated discussions of contemporary world literature." In other words, the novel moves easily across border, it translates well, it fits neatly within the publishing infrastructures and reading publics on which world literature depends. Other theorists have made similar observations. Pascal Casanova, in The World Republic of Letters, connects the novel's dominance to the very structure of the global literary marketplace, to the systems of value and exchange that determine which texts circulate internationally and which remain invisible. Others have rationalized the dominance of the novel as the global genre par excellence by pointing to its unique relationship with the historical process of globalization. As Mariano Siskind explains, because the novel was the hegemonic form that bourgeois imagination adopted in the 19th century, and because of the aesthetic and political force of the social totalities it was capable of constructing, most novels dealing with distant places produce powerful images of the globalization of bourgeois culture. So in short, the novel became not only a product of globalization, but one of its narrative engines, a form through which readers around the world learned to imagine the global itself. And so, by extension, even those today who seek to make cracks in the geography of world literature, as Tanuki put it, still tend to begin with the novel, particularly post-colonial novel, as their point of departure. Yet another explanation for this neglect lies in the tension between elitism and populism. World literature has long operated according to a logic of prestige and circulation, a system in which texts achieve world status not only for their artistic merit, but because they enter transnational networks of translation, critical recognition, and institutional consecration. In this cosmopolitan model, literature becomes worldly by traveling, by being translated, taught, and celebrated within the global literary marketplace. This framework naturally privileges certain kinds of works, those that display aesthetic autonomy, formal innovation, and the ability to speak what seems like a universal language. And we can see this logic still at work today. Just this month, the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to the Hungarian author László Krasznahorkai, a writer whose long, spiraling sentences and philosophical density have made his novels among the most translatable and circulable forms of Hungarian literature. So it's a striking example of how world literature continues to reward precisely the kind of textual difficulty that can be exported, works that seem to rise above their local and linguistic roots. The more a text appears to transcend its specific origins, the more readily it is welcomed into the canon of world literature. Now, life writing, by contrast, tends to resist this kind of circulation. Its strength lies precisely in its embeddedness, in the grain of the particular voice, the weight of lived experience, the textures of language and place. Autobiographical narratives draw their power from immediacy and relationality. They depend on the ethical encounter between self and other, often reaching readers through affective resonance rather than elite mediation. In many ways, life writing is said to be the most democratic of literary forms. Autobiography and memoir have long been associated with accessibility and inclusivity. They require no special literary education to write and or read, and they invite anyone, regardless of class, gender, geography, to take part in the act of meaning making. So this democratizing impulse runs deep in literary history, from early slave narratives and working class autobiographies to contemporary blogs, social media posts, and testimonial storytelling projects. Each represents an assertion of voice and visibility by those so often excluded from official histories. So in this sense, autobiography does function not only as a literary act, but as a political one, a way of entering the public sphere through the telling of life. Still, to frame world literature as purely elitist and life writing as purely populist would be far too simple. Many forms of life writing, from Rousseau's Confessions to contemporary celebrity memoirs, operate comfortably within the circuits of prestige and global consumption. And while world literature has often privileged texts that travel through elite channels of translation and institutional consecration, life writing reminds us that the world of literature is also built from below, through countless small personal acts of storytelling that together shape our collective sense of the world. So the real issue, I think, isn't simply a matter of elitism versus populism. It's about different economies of value. World literature has traditionally privileged mobility and abstraction, while life writing insists on presence and relationality. But the real challenge then is to imagine a framework capacious enough to hold both. And I'll return to this at the end of my talk, to this challenge. But first, I want to pause for a moment on this curious absence of autobiographical genres in world literature scholarship. This blind spot, as I will call it, or maybe perhaps we should better describe it as a disciplinary bias, strikes me as surprising for at least three reasons. The first reason is historical. Because despite the seeming disconnect in recent scholarship, world literature and life writing actually share a long and intertwined history. It's no coincidence that the very idea of world literature, in the singular, first gained traction in the post-Enlightenment era, precisely when Western autobiographers were beginning to treat life writing as a privileged tool for shaping an autonomous self distinct from the other. According to one Western genealogy, the term Weltliteratur was coined by Goethe to describe what he saw as the capacity of literature to transcend national and linguistic barriers. Critics have often analyzed the tensions in Goethe's reflections on world literature, his ambivalence about cosmopolitanism, his anxiety about national canons, but they have rarely connected these ideas to his own autobiographical project. I argue that it was Goethe's own self-reflection, or more precisely, his awareness of his place within what Pascal Casanova would later call the World Republic of Letters, that prompted Goethe's reflections on world literature in the first place. If we look closely at his autobiography, Dichtung und Wahrheit, we can see that Goethe's idea of world literature is already inseparable from an autobiographical mode of thinking. His historicist understanding of his life as one uniquely situated within the intellectual and political transformations of late Enlightenment Europe appears at first to stand in contrast to the cosmopolitan aspirations of Weltliteratur. His autobiographical stance seems modest, even local. It values what we might now call situated knowledge, the unique and contingent perspective of a self in history. And yet, paradoxically, it was precisely this insistence on historical situatedness that later became a normative force within world literature, a criterion of legitimacy that excluded others. To write oneself into world literature required, implicitly, the privilege of a certain vantage point, the ability to see one's own life as historically significant, as part of a recognizable narrative of progress and modernity. And those who could not, whose lives did not fit the Eurocentric framework of the modern self, were, of course, rendered invisible. Furthermore, both the genre of life writing and the concept of world literature have, at key moments in their history, been complicit in an Orientalist understanding of cosmopolitanism, one that privileges the Western gaze as the universal standard of comparison. To stay with Goethe for a moment, his idea of Weltliteratur was in many ways undoubtedly visionary. He imagined it as a kind of cultural diplomacy, a tool for opening channels of communication between nations. And yet, Goethe's enthusiasm for foreign literatures was not free from the assumptions of his time. His curiosity was shaped by the same appropriating impulse that guided early European travel writers, those who used autobiographical narratives of their journeys to distant lands to construct what Marie-Louise Prat later called a planetary consciousness. Goethe encouraged his readers to engage in a kind of imaginative travel, to visit writers of distant cultures on their own ground, in their own languages. We need to Orientalize ourselves. The Orient will not come to us, he famously declared. But notice his language. Goethe consistently described this process through visual metaphors. He wanted readers to look around, hinausblicken, and to look around, umsehen. And the act of seeing the world or surveying its diversity was central to his idea of world literature as well. So this privileging of sight echoed the Enlightenment ideal of visual clarity, the fantasy of a detached, totalizing perspective, as if the world could be comprehended in one sweeping gaze. And here lies the paradox. We might expect life writing as an intimate and subjective genre to resist this objectifying worldview, to counter the view from nowhere with a view from somewhere, grounded in personal experience. But historically, actually, life writing has just as often participated in that same orientalizing gaze. From early travel diaries and missionary memoirs to colonial autobiographies, life writing too has helped construct the West's imagined map of the world. In this sense, both world literature and life writing share a common origin in the same project of seeing and ultimately, of course, mastering the world through narrative. So there's a deep historical complicity here, and that to me makes the current blind spot in world literature scholarship toward autobiographical genres all the more surprising. Now, the second reason why I'm surprised by this bias is because there is an obvious disconnect between the narrow focus of world literature theorists today on fictional genres and the much broader reading habits of actual readers around the world today. If we look at what circulates most widely or just as widely as world literature in the 21st century, it's often not fiction at all. It's nonfiction, personal stories, memoirs, testimonial narratives, written in response to the global events shaping our time. At the turn of the millennium, when new forms of globalization were taking shape, world literature was often promoted as a kind of cure for nationalism, as a way of educating global citizens through empathy. This instrumental idea that literature could serve as a form of cultural diplomacy led both educators and publishers to turn towards texts that offered a first-person window into diverse human experiences. And these weren't marginal or experimental works. Alongside the canonical autobiographies of St. Augustine or Rousseau, we began to see texts like De Respuesta by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, or The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, or The Pillow Book by Say Shonagon, or they were all presented as world literature classics. More recently, readers have embraced Persepolis, Ake, The Years of Childhood, or Reading Lolita in Tehran. And publishers and teachers recognized this shift in the 1990s and 2000s. As postcolonial and transnational studies reshaped the humanities, memoirs and testimonial narratives began to anchor anthologies of world literature. Penguin and Norton editions that once centered on the European novel started to include writers like Rigoberto Menchú or Primo Levi or Ngugi Thiong. So these weren't just new names. They signaled a new kind of literary worldliness, one rooted not in imagination alone, but in experience, in testimony, and in survival. I would even argue that the resurgence of world literature as a field owes much to this diversification of its corpus, to the inclusion of personal narratives that speak across borders and bear witness to shared histories. In that sense, world literature may have been revitalized not by the global novel, but by the global memoir. The third reason I find this blind spot so surprising has to do with something even more fundamental. The failed encounter between world literature and life writing, at least at the level of scholarship, is puzzling because life writing has always been central to the very process of worlding, the world part of world literature. As I mentioned earlier, by foregrounding that small but crucial word life writing scholars were among the first to insist that literature is not an autonomous aesthetic realm, but something deeply entangled with the social, the ethical, the everyday. In other words, they have always understood literature is embedded in life. And that's precisely why I find it so strange that world literature theorists, so deeply concerned with how texts move through the world, have rarely engaged with a field that from its very beginning has been asking how lives themselves circulate through language. Now, this may have to do with the question of genre, of course. The question is, in what sense is life writing a genre? And that depends, of course, on how we define genre, and I won't go too deep into that today, but let me just say that I agree with Mariano Siskind, who emphasizes the performative aspect of genres and texts. According to Siskind, it's this performative function that makes genres and texts belong to world literature. As he puts it, genres and texts belong to world literature not because of what they are, but because of what they do. Because they perform global desires, because they further transcultural goals, and because they resist the immediacy of meaning as a function of the local, whether national or regional. Similarly, life writing scholars like Paul Jonikin have argued that life writing is better understood as a field or a practice rather than a single genre, because what unites these texts isn't a shared form of structure, but a shared function, the act of narrating a life. And of course, one can emphasize the rhetorical and performative aspects of that act, as Philippe Lejeune did with his idea of the autobiographical contract, or one can focus on identifying recognizable literary forms within the broader tradition. For instance, in the second edition of Reading Autobiography, Sidney Smith and Julia Watson included an appendix titled 60 Genres of Life Narrative. It's a remarkable catalog that spans an extraordinary range of practices and media, textual, visual, digital, and performative forms of self-representation. But even Smith and Watson conclude that life writing is not a single genre, but a matrix of related practices of self-representation. And I find this capacious definition particularly appealing. To me, personal storytelling is something we all engage in, a way of shaping experience into meaning, of arranging memory into narrative to sustain our sense of identity. Every time we tell someone who we are crafting a version of our life story. From St. Augustine's Confessions to the story features of on social media, the impulse is the same, to make a life intelligible and shareable through narrative form. So if you think about it this way, then life writing doesn't just belong in world literature, it actually creates world literature. Through personal stories, local experiences become legible to others across borders, languages, time. In that sense, life writing has always been one of the most powerful worlding forces in literary history, even if our scholarship has been slow to recognize it. And so here I'm getting to the crux of the issue, or at least to what I find most fascinating about the relationship between life writing and world literature. Because as we wrote in our edited volume, what truly brings these two fields together is what we might call the worlding power of narrative. Grounded in specific lives, yet shaped by equally specific acts of reading and interpretation, our stories do not merely circulate in the world, they create worlds. So life writing in this sense is both a literary and an existential practice, a way of sorting experience. And whether we define it as a discourse, rhetoric, or performance, it's also a form of action, a social act that encodes and reshapes the values by which we live. So to speak of the worlding power of life writing is to recognize that our stories do not merely reflect the world, they help bring it into being. So here I rely on Feng Chia's arguments. The notion of worlding originates, of course, in philosophy with Heidegger and in world literature theory, but to me, it's personal storytelling that actually really brings this concept into focus. As Feng Chia argues in What is a World on Postcolonial Literature as World Literature, literature does not simply mirror a pre-existing reality, it actively participates in creating the world itself. Chia reminds us that the worldliness of world literature does not derive from its being a passive reflection of the forces at work in a global market. In other words, world literature is not just a matter of circulation, translation, or market exchange. Instead, literature can play an active role in the world's ongoing creation because, in its very existence, it enacts the opening of a world. So now, Chia's examples mostly come from the novel, as I demonstrated earlier, but I would argue that his insight applies just as powerfully, perhaps even more so, to life writing. Personal narratives, after all, don't just describe lived experience, they instantiate it. Each act of telling a life story reconfigures what counts as a livable world, what can be shared, and who gets to speak. And in that sense, life writing isn't simply part of world literature, it's one of its most active world-making forces. And yet, even critics in the field of life writing have long struggled to describe this creative power, to explain how exactly personal stories do not simply reflect life, but actually bring it into being. One major strand of thought, going back to the 1960s, emphasizes the phenomenological dimension of life writing, the centrality of lived experience in the sense developed by Husserl and later phenomenologists. From this perspective, personal narratives are not just records of what happened, they are ways of experiencing and understanding the world. They are grounded in what Donna Haraway later called situated knowledges, the idea that every act of storytelling emerges from a particular embodied position in the world, from a perceiving subject whose consciousness, memory, and perspective are always local and partial. The authority of the autobiographical voice, then, comes not from objectivity but from this situatedness, from the claim that the truth of a life can only be grasped from within it. So this is the phenomenological. Now there's a second, more recent strand of critique, which approaches the problem of world making through the lens of materiality. Scholars such as Karen Barad and Anna Poletti remind us that matter itself, bodies, objects, technologies, and media, is not a passive channel through which life gets expressed, but an active participant in the creation of meaning. As Karen Barad writes, we are not outside observers of the world. Neither are we simply located at particular places in the world. Rather, we are part of the world in its ongoing intra-activity. In other words, storytellers don't stand apart from their media, whether it's a pen, a camera, or a screen, they co-emerge with them. Our stories are shaped by the tools and environments through which they are told, just as our sense of self takes form in relation to those same material and social forces. So life in this view is not merely bios, as in autobiography, the individual biographical life of a subject, but zoe, the shared vitality of all living and non-living matter intertwined and in motion. So both of these are, the phenomenological and the material, are important ways of thinking about the worlding power of personal stories. seeing life as an embodied material practice opens up fresh pathways for world literature scholarship as well. But, and I'm almost done here, it seems to me that something is still missing from recent accounts of this worlding power. And so since I'll need to wrap up soon, let me leave you with what I believe may be one possible reason why scholars of life writing and world literature have not engaged more deeply with one another in recent years. So in my view, what's missing from life writing scholarship is the perspective of critical hermeneutics, which is like a third strand to be added to the phenomenological and material critiques. Unlike traditional hermeneutics, which aim to recover meaning, a hermeneutics of suspicion recognizes the open-endedness of every narrative and seeks the potentialities embedded within it. And so that word potentiality is key for me, because when we place too much emphasis on the authority of lived experience and on the authenticity that's presumed to flow from this authority, then life writing scholarship can slip toward a kind of determinism. Especially in readings of testimonial writing, scholars have sometimes leapt too quickly from the phenomenological point of view, the individual's direct experience of the world, to the truth value of the narrative, as if the story arose organically out of that Erlebnis or lived experience. So the need to affirm the epistemic authority of first-person testimony is, of course, a deeply political task, but it's limiting to assume that experience alone constitutes meaning. What critical hermeneutics offers is a reminder that every narrative is already textualized, mediated, shaped, and open to interpretation. And it's precisely through that process of textualization, through the reflective distance that interpretation provides, that lived experience gains its power. Paradoxically, it's this very distance that sets experience free, allowing one's story to travel, to be translated, and to be reimagined beyond the boundaries of the self. So I argue that we need to bring in more hermeneutics and more suspicion, not as cynicism, but as a method of expansion, a way to unmoor personal narratives from the fixities of experience and to release their world-making potential. In fact, the abstraction and the aestheticism and global orientation that characterize much of world literature scholarship can, perhaps paradoxically, help amplify the intimate and relational power of life writing. As I suggested earlier, the real issue isn't a simple binary, elitism versus populism, or worldliness versus situatedness, but a matter of different economies of value. World literature has traditionally rewarded mobility and abstraction, while life writing has insisted on presence and relationality. So the challenge, and I also see this as an opportunity, is to imagine a model capacious enough to hold both. So to do this, life writing scholars need to become a little more suspicious of the authority of personal experience, while world literature scholars need to lean more fully into the mediated value of that experience. And let me end on an autobiographical note. Having grown up behind the Iron Curtain, I remain cautious of interpretations that limit literature's power to purely activist or collectivist functions, whether in materialist or poetic registers. What continues to fascinate me instead is the realm of possibility, the sense that, as Ernst Bloch also reminds us, not all people exist in the same here and now, and that these divergent temporalities and spatialities leave open the unfulfilled hopes and projects of the past for our present. It is in this sense that literature, as Feng Chia writes, enacts the opening of a world. And it is for this reason that we need to pay more attention, even within world literature scholarship, to the power of personal storytelling. For there is profound power, not only individual, but also social, in imagining what Jerome Bruner called possible alternative personal perspectives. Every act of personal storytelling, however local or fleeting, is an existential gesture of reimagining and reinterpreting the world with others. And this, I believe, is where the microcosm of personal stories and the macrocosm of world literature converge. Both are acts of possibility, nothing less and nothing more. Thank you.
Has been really wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very rich and really thought-provoking talk. Your reflections here on this whirling power of life narratives, I believe they really open fascinating directions for further discussion. Um, I'd like to now move to the Q&A session, and I really invite all the participants here to share their questions or observations, either by unmuting themselves or using the chat box. So you are all welcome to ask or let's say to comment on this wonderful talk. Thank you again, Helga. But perhaps as others, I mean, the international audience here, they are all preparing, they are all thinking, I could indulge myself in asking my first question because I have been quite, what do you call, engaged with world literature debates in the last years of my research. And I thought, this has been really thought-provoking, as I said, but I was especially struck by how you really frame this tension between world literature's emphasis on mobility and abstraction, and also life writing's investment in presence and relationality. So I was really wondering, Helga, do you think that integrating life writing more fully into world literature frameworks could also, in a way, transform our sense of literary value? Perhaps, in a way, shifting it from circulation and, prestige toward more relational ethics, as you already mentioned, and modes of care. Could really attention to personal storytelling help us imagine in a way a less perhaps hierarchical, in a way more ethically grounded model of world literature? I wonder, how you would actually comment on this after this brilliant lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, absolutely. I do believe firmly that world literature scholarship can gain a lot from this hopefully future potential dialogue with life writing studies. I do see a lot of room for collaboration there. And I'm particularly interested in how in world literature scholarship in recent years, people try to move away from the market-oriented spatial understanding of world literature, something that books circulate in as if it was a container, spatial container, getting past national borders, and moving towards an interest in time. So moving from space to time, and that's what Feng Chia does in his book, arguing that too much emphasis on space has created an overemphasis in world literature as well on spatial boundaries and overcoming those. And instead, he goes back to essentially the 19th century origin of the capitalist world and rethinking the world as one, which was actually just as importantly conditioned by time, right? The classic example is when the train tables were first synchronized in the late 19th century, and the kind of image of the world that those synchronized timetables allowed for, right? For how people could imagine it. And I think that time still plays a very important role in the way I think about the role of literature and the unfolding of meaning. when I talk about potentiality, I'm thinking about how meaning unfolds in time, and we're not paying enough attention to that. And I think that that is a potentially productive way to bring together life writing scholarship and world literature, is focus more on the temporal dimension of meaning making instead of thinking of world literature as these containers existing in different countries and the circulation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, this has kind of resonated me for quite some time, and I was also thinking about these personal stories of people, how they come to be, in a way, excluded from this space, as you said. Yeah, this has certainly rung a bell for me in a way. Well, I have been waiting for others perhaps to pose their questions or
I
post
would
their
like
comments.
to